Hello, all you textual deviants, and welcome to another special emergency edition of Texting. I'm one of your hosts, Mark Will in Taipei.
And I'm Tomek in St. Petersburg. So, Mark and I have been in contact quite a bit over the last 10 days in response to the events in Israel and Palestine. And
Hasn't been 10 days, has it? It's been a week, right? Today is Saturday here. It's Saturday here. Last Saturday is when that attack took place, right? Or was it Friday night?
I think you're right. I think I was erring on the side of caution, so I thought I would go longer than yeah, I would say
right now, Taipei time, it's Saturday, October 14th, just after 9 p.m. And I think I first heard about the Hamas surprise attack on Israel last Saturday morning or afternoon. Whenever I got up, I saw a message from you saying, "You see what's happening?" I'm like, "No." And I got up, and then, of course, I immediately saw the news. You can't avoid it. So it's been a week.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you clarified the record. Yeah, and it seems like the most significant...
You froze on me there.
...political event since the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And it's a particularly grisly moment, I think, because the world is waiting for the massacre to begin, really, for this ground invasion to commence. And we're all kind of standing back and consuming media. Anyone who is interested and follows current affairs is consuming something. And obviously what you consume is going to be critical to this conversation, and how that shapes your perspective. And we're hearing all kinds of perspectives, some of which can be very upsetting, triggering, and stupefying. So we don't really have a concrete goal today, I think, except to maybe vent our own frustrations and just opinions about a potentially very historic moment, and historic for terrible and horrifying reasons. But we want to say our piece, I guess. What do you think?
Well, to be clear, just so we can set the parameters of this discussion, I mean, this is an episode of texting, so our text is the current situation in Israel-Palestine.
Right. That's right.
Okay. So our knowledge of this text comes from various sources. Maybe we should talk about what we know about it. Like, if we're reading this text, what is the source of our information? I mean, some of our sources have been the same. We've been trading links, sending messages back and forth. We've watched some of the same videos, read some of the same articles. Maybe we should explain where we're getting our information, because if our sources are somehow flawed, then our understanding of the text is also potentially flawed, right?
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I think I'll only speak for myself here, but I don't necessarily have the patience or bandwidth to do real scholarly research. And what I would consider real scholarly research would be reading books on the history of the conflict, speaking to people on the ground. So I think, yeah, there's a there's a depth of knowledge that perhaps I'm missing. I still think I know more than the average person, but I am guilty of kind of consuming a lot of Twitter, as well as stuff that's a bit more substantial. But obviously in Twitter, you've just got like a quick series of shock headlines. And while they may be interesting and useful to some extent, but it kind of leaves me feeling a bit drained and futile after a Twitter session. I don't know about you. But okay, just to come back to your topic of the types of media that we are consuming. So as far as broadsheet, you know that I click on The Guardian a lot, despite hating The Guardian. It's just the most convenient website, I guess, that, well, it's just got a nice interface, and you get a certain perspective from The Guardian, so you kind of know what the neoliberal...
What the normies are thinking.
I guess so, even though, like, in theory, it's a little bit maybe more interesting than, like, CNN, I guess, right? So it's like a hair more interesting, or like a hair more intellectual, but still, like, pretty offensive most of the time. A cursory scan of Counterpunch, which is an online journal, much better than The Guardian. And we've got a series of YouTube channels, which I guess you could label as far left, or just independent. And they tend to be anti-imperial, anti-war voices, anti-establishment. What do you think? Can you add to that?
Well, I've not visited the Counterpunch website for a while. What are they saying over there?
I would just say you get a Palestinian voice there, right? Or you get Palestinian advocates to a degree that you won't get on The Guardian. Although I was happy to see at least one article today pushing back on this call for mass displacement. So I think The Guardian, interestingly, does, while they're staunchly anti-Russia and never present an anti-NATO view, like really never, but they have a significant portion of their audience that is sympathetic to Palestine, sympathetic to Islam. So I do think that they cater to that audience to some extent. So they'll pay some lip service to that side on this issue. Yeah. But yeah, so Counterpunch, as I said,
feed. I can still hear you, but I can't see you.
Okay, I don't know if you've got going?
Connectivity issues. Yeah, just keep going. But
I'll make sure
I've lost your sound. I've lost your sound twice, and I now can't see you. Are you using Chrome?
Yeah, using Chrome. VPN's off.
You're plugged in?
Plugged in.
So, I don't know. Maybe the recording will be better than what I'm seeing live. Maybe we should talk about, I'm noticing your screen name, Tom the Unprovoked. That word unprovoked has been particularly triggering, I guess, to both of us. Maybe we should start with that. Like, why is it that, let's say, the mainstream media has made such an effort to convince everyone that, oh, this attack that occurred last week was unprovoked? I mean, who could have predicted it?
Absolutely. I think it shouldn't surprise us that narratives are simplified to justify war, but anyone with an ounce of critical apparatus should push back on that, and shame on both politicians and journalists who engage that narrative, the idea that things come without a cause except for evil tendencies and subhuman behavior. So yeah, I mean, we talked about this we considered making this podcast like a dual response to Ukraine as well. And we've talked before about, is Russia acting imperialistically in Ukraine, or is it fighting the American empire? And probably it's both, but the idea that Russia invaded Ukraine unprovoked seems naive to both of us, and yet that is strategically kept out of any mainstream argument in the West. And as you said,
and interestingly, interestingly, that's the same narrative. It's like they just use the same terminology for the new conflict, right? Like whoever the empire's enemy is, their actions will always be described as unprovoked, because of course our side never does anything. Our side never does anything wrong, never does anything to provoke action, and that's why in this case we never hear the word occupation, we never hear the word blockade, we never hear the word, apartheid,
open air prison,
or
apartheid,
open air prison, open air concentration camp, ethno state. None of that context is provided. It's just, look at these terrorist animals. I mean, some people have, and they're even using it. Some people are saying, "Oh, this is Israel's 9/11." Wow. Okay. Nothing insane evolved out of that event in 2001, did it? That rhetoric was never exploited by anyone, right? That it just happened and everyone recognized it, and then there was a completely rational response. Nothing to worry about there. Yeah, it's Israel's 9/11. So therefore, time for jihad, time for holy war, because you're either with us or you're with the terrorists.
Right. And it's very interesting, the sort of schism that's taking place in various countries between the power structure of that country and the citizens. And I know you know what I mean by that, but just to make it clear to the audience, we've got official residences or government buildings in the UK, in France, in the US, projecting images of the Israeli flag, while larger numbers of its citizens are supporting Palestine on the streets. And worryingly, these protests are being shut down. Yeah, it's not like countries are unified behind Israel, the Western countries that are showing support from their power structures, right? So, I mean, that's just something maybe we could explore as a separate thread, but and I should say that even extends to Islamic countries like Morocco, like Egypt, I would guess. I mean, many countries that are beholden to Israel and America for money and for weaponry, but their citizens have a very different view and are standing in solidarity with Palestine at this moment.
Well, maybe you could speak to that. You certainly know more about it than me. What do you think the feeling is on the ground in Morocco? Like, are you still in touch with your friends there? Is it really like that? It's like,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are protests on the street. I can't speak exactly to like the proportion of citizens that are, ready to be an activist at this moment, but there's no doubt in my mind that in Muslim majority countries, at least 85% of people are like staunchly behind Palestine. And yeah, I have seen images of huge protests. So
that's
yeah.
Well, when I hear you say Muslim majority, that's so interesting because, you know, I think there's a tendency to describe all Palestinians as Muslims, which is far from the case. Like when I visited, and as I've told you, I visited Israel-Palestine during the last asymmetrical war of 2014. And, I could use this opportunity to promote my forthcoming book, Pilgrimizing, which is about that trip, and it's going to be released later this month. What perfect timing. What perfect timing, right? But one of the things that surprised me, it shouldn't have, but if I had thought about it for 5 minutes, but a huge, percentage of the Palestinian population is actually Christian. And, some of them are actually Jewish. And of course there are Muslims too, but it's not like a monolith. So, we forget, for example, Nazareth, like there are a lot of Christians there. Guess what? That was the hometown of Jesus Christ, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's also in a Palestinian area. I went there, So any effort to like describe it as, it's Muslim versus Jew, it's that's such an oversimplification.
Well, I appreciate the nuance you're bringing, but just gonna push back a little bit because I've Googled it and it says 98% of Palestinians identify as Sunni Muslims. So this is basically a Muslim population. I know what you're saying.
Well, I don't
those
know
stats
if those
could be
are
wrong, but
yeah, I don't know if those are if those are accurate numbers in every area. I think I remember I've actually got the numbers of the population split in Nazareth specifically, and it's much more balanced than that.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna read a text about what has been like triggering me the most. So it's a very short text that I wrote to my friend today. It just said, my main gripes are, number one, Western governments giving uncritical, unreserved support for Israel. 2, legacy media using language like unprovoked, which we've just addressed, to describe Hamas's attacks. And 3, media not giving equal voice to Palestinian voices. So do you want to respond to any of that, or do you want to just like talk about how you're engaging with the media at this point and what you think we can do besides I'm get upset?
I'm in agreement with all of your concerns. I share those concerns myself. Like that context is critical. Whatever happened, and again, we've already heard some debunking, right? Like there was a rumor, and it was nothing but a rumor. A soldier said, babies were beheaded. A reporter said, a soldier told me babies were beheaded. And then it was like trumpeted everywhere, like every news channel, even like Israeli government officials were saying they beheaded babies. And then we find out a couple of days later, actually, no, that didn't happen. So
and Biden claiming to have seen the photographs.
Oh, I didn't even know that, but I'm not surprised, so
which then the White House took back the next day.
So of course there are going to be all kinds of sensationalistic. It just reminded me of the babies in incubators of the storyline from the 90s. Remember that when George Bush the first wanted to have his invasion of Iraq, and like no one was for it, and then they had like the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter give testimony, and she said, there were babies dying on the cold floor. And then they and that whole campaign was designed by an advertising firm, and guess what? It worked. Like, support for the invasion grew from whatever it was, 10% to 60 or 70%. And it was all a lie, 100% manufactured. So that was, anytime I hear about that, oh, babies in incubators, babies beheaded, babies bayoneted. Maybe it could have happened, but let's wait and see. And then, a couple days later, oh, actually, that didn't happen. And then there are other stories about, Hamas, or whoever they are. Who are they? We don't know. Hamas or some other Palestinian resistance fighter, showing humanity and urging people not to panic and not to worry. I mean, I'm sure there were atrocities, and we can discuss the meaning of that too, but it's not the picture that had been painted, by biased mainstream media sources who were running with a particular narrative and would use anything to, make their case basically for brutal retaliation and even, violation of international law. What are they saying now? It's like, yes, there was that British official. I think you sent me that video. I don't even remember his name, Steer something or Stare something. And he's like, well, they need to follow international law, but if they want to cut the water and the electricity and
are you talking about the labor leader, like Keir Starmer?
Oh, Keir, that's his name. Yeah.
Keir Starmer. Uh-huh.
Yeah. What did
Probably
I call
the
him?
future prime minister.
Steer or Keir, whatever. So he's like, well, they need to follow international law. Of course they do. But yeah, they can cut the electricity, block food. Basically, siege. That's siege warfare, which, as far as I know, is it's against international law. That's a war crime. So they have to follow international law, but at the same time, they can break international law. I mean, this is what the objection to the Saudi siege in Yemen was based on, right? Like, siege warfare is a war crime. It's illegal under international law. So what do you mean they have to follow international law? And then, of course, the standard line is Israel has a right to defend itself. That's what we're going to hear that, ad nauseum. Israel has a right to defend itself. Okay, so do Palestinian concentration camp inmates or open air prison inmates, or however you want to describe the people of Gaza, do they have a right to resist? Well, under international law, apparently they do. Occupied populations can resist, and that includes violence. So if you want to follow the law, I mean, that's what it says. And, others have pointed to, like, controversial heroes such as Nat Turner, who led a slave uprising, right? He killed innocents, but what was he doing? He was resisting slavery. So, if you don't want that kind of reaction, then how about dealing with the situation, like abolishing slavery or ending the occupation or, canceling the blockade? Then a lot of those conditions for the violence which has taken place will no longer exist, and maybe you can end the violence that way. But of course, Netanyahu and those fucking clowns have no desire to do that. In fact, we've heard that I mean, he admitted it publicly. It's in Haaretz or some of the other Israeli papers. He said a good strategy is to fund Hamas. Hamas is good because it divides the population, right? Like they were tired of dealing with the PLO, who were secular, so they promote Hamas, who are religious fanatics. It's the same playbook that we've seen the
In
empire use
Afghanistan.
over and over. Exactly. Mujahideen, right? Oh, let's call these guys freedom fighters. So, and apparently they actually funded them, like they were financing them, which is insane to think about. This is why some people like Scott Ritter and others are saying that, Netanyahu is doomed. He's fucked. Whatever happens, like he's going down. Do you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to ask, do you want to describe, to the best of your knowledge, like, granted that we're not pretending to be experts, but I still think you are somewhat knowledgeable on this. Do you want to describe like the geographic landscape of Israel? Just so keep it kind of basic. In terms of what I mean by that is like the positioning of the Gaza Strip, the positioning of the West Bank, and maybe what life is like in both, if you know, and the differences between life in both places, and anything that you know about just the geographic reality.
Well, I mean, I
know I'm putting you on the spot, but you can just give it a shot.
Well, let's talk about the Gaza Strip first, right? That's basically the southwest corner of Israel-Palestine. And it's, I think I heard Norm Finkelstein describe it as 5 miles wide and 25 miles long, something like that. So it's just a little strip in the southwest corner of
that's crazy. Eretz, yeah, that's so small.
Eretz Israel, and it's more densely populated than Tokyo, I'm told. Now I didn't go there. I of course not. I wasn't allowed to go there. But I've seen it on a map, and it is a little strip like that, and I can believe that it's 5 miles wide by 25 miles long. That sounds about right.
With 2.1 million people, I believe, right? That's the number that's usually quoted.
Half of whom are children.
And half of whom are kids, right? I'm just looking at a map now. I put the link into... Yeah. I put the link in the chat. Can you see that?
Let me see. Okay, I'm opening it up now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that a group of people could be, like, how it got to the point where a group of people were boxed in to this tiny strip of land, I mean, that's obviously something that a historian would easily be able to explain, but for me, I don't know the backstory. I just appreciate the tragedy that's going on, and the general awareness. I mean, one thing I've heard, and this is not even probably controversial, but that the ground invasion that's going to take place now is just essentially going to give Israel more land, So on a crude level, this is just
a land grab.
A land grab, and it's like saying that one solution is just there to be no more Palestine, right? And to be no more Palestinians. Like that, ultimately, that's like one simplistic and horrific at the same time, like, solution, right?
Well, and then the Israel apologists or Zionist apologists are saying things like, well, we're giving them warning, we're telling them to leave. It's their choice. They can just leave. And that I think there's some kind of corridor into Egypt, right? Like they can leave from Gaza and go into Egypt. But then I heard, and again, who knows, but if that kind of information got through all the mainstream media filters and censorship, it's probably true. They're bombing the corridor. So, what do they What do they really want to do? They just want to wipe those people off the face of the earth. They just want them gone. They want them to disappear.
Well, and another point of discussion a lot of people are talking about is the fact that Egypt seems very reluctant to accept refugees. I think that's a complicated issue in itself, but because as soon as you start accepting them, it's probably the more humane thing to do, but you're also like officially surrendering the land, right? So I still think people should be allowed to leave, because that's their life, right? So on a basic level, Egypt should accept refugees, I would say, if there's no other way. I mean, I don't subscribe to the idea that it's like better to stay and resist with the high probability of death, and I mean, I'm just saying, if I was there, right, I would be trying to get the fuck out.
Right, but can you blame people that want to stay? I mean, many people are
definitely
making
not.
that. Yeah, many people are making that choice. It's like, how many years has it been? How many ways have we tried? And of course, that context is never provided either, right? Like what was it called? The March of the Great Return in 2018 or 2019 or whatever it was. It was a peaceful protest. They they walked up to the border. Many of these people were like handicapped, or they were kids, they were elderly, and then they just got shot in the kneecaps. People were killed. So that was prevented. No nonviolent protests. We're not going to allow that. Okay, well, we'll do BDS. We'll do a boycott, divestment, sanctions. Nope, that's illegal. And if you support that in the U.S., you're going to get censored, which is crazy. I mean, what the fuck is the U.S. involving itself in that for, right? Like, a U.S. citizen cannot have an opinion on a boycott because it offends a foreign country. That is completely insane. But okay, so that doesn't work. They've tried it every single way. So wasn't it JFK who said, like, he who makes, peaceful protest impossible makes violent revolt inevitable, or whatever it is. Like, if you just look at it from a common sense perspective, what did you think was going to happen?
For sure. And when it gets this extreme, like hostage taking, as despicable as it is, it's the only strategy that is possible to,
because it's worked before,
get any kind of leverage. Right.
One Israeli soldier that was kidnapped, I can't remember his name, several years ago, they kept him alive, and they traded him for like 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, something like that.
Right.
Maybe I have the numbers wrong. Yeah. So right. if they take all these hostages, maybe they're going to get some people out. That's the strategy, and it worked before. I mean, again, these are horrific occurrences. So what are you doing to address the root causes? How about ending the blockade, ending the occupation? No, they have no intention of doing that. They don't want to do that. And, the U.S. role in it is, of course, critical, essential. Why on earth are U.S. taxpayers funding this? Well, we know why, because Israel is the U.S. attack dog in the Middle East, right? Like, it's the imperial outpost in that part of the world. So, okay, that's what you're paying for, U.S. taxpayers.
Go on.
You like that? You're partly responsible, I mean, what can the average citizen do? Like, the whole Congress, the entire military industrial complex, like, they don't care what the populace says or wants, they're going to just keep doing what they do. So that we can say, no, I'm not in favor of that, but it doesn't matter. And even the so-called politicians that are like supposed to be anti-establishment, look at all those Republicans that were, complaining about expenditures in Ukraine. Why are we doing this? But the minute something happens to Israel, we got to stand in solidarity with them.
Exactly. It's very revealing. I mean, Marjorie Taylor Greene just posing for pictures with Code Pink last week, and people defending her, including Jimmy, who I'm not throwing him under the bus when I say that, but and other leftists pointing out Code Pink's hypocrisy in then distancing themselves from this photo moment with Marjorie Taylor Greene. But now she's coming out, all guns blazing in support of Israel. So it's a pity.
Well,
it's a pity that
Matt Gaetz too, right? Matt Gaetz too, who is championed for his criticisms of McCarthy and actually that they had a good strategy, right? It's what the so-called squad should have done with Pelosi. It worked. Mm-hmm. It actually worked, right? And they proved that. But then when it's Israel, well, he's just as shitty as everyone else. And, more disappointing, perhaps, is the reaction of RFK Jr. I mean, what on earth? Like, it's not surprising now because he's been making ridiculous statements for months now, starting with the time he removed or he deleted his tweet in support of Roger Waters. Remember that?
Yeah.
I don't know when that was, several months ago now, right? And then he says, oh, well, I meant I found his take on, mandates and his criticism of the Ukraine situation. I thought that was laudable, but then I found out he was an anti-Semite. That was already a huge red flag. And now he's like more bloodthirsty than the worst neocon. Like he wants to increase spending. Like he wants to send more aid to Israel. It's like, I don't think you've thought this through, Bobby.
It's funny you mentioned this because as you were speaking, or just before you brought up RFK, I was going to mention how Kucinich has actually just left. He's been replaced on the campaign. And,
I didn't know that.
Dennis Kucinich. Yeah. And, but Kucinich has always been an advocate of Palestine, and he's a well-known pacifist. So it's not a huge shock.
He just left, or he was removed?
He was replaced. He was replaced. I don't know if it was by mutual consent. I don't know who directed that shift, but now he's been replaced by a family member, I guess.
Oh my, that's interesting.
RFK. Yeah, this is.
I wonder what his take will be on it now. Like, I'd like to hear his side of the story. What happened? Why did he leave? Was it about this issue specifically? It very likely was. But while we're talking about presidential candidates, let's consider Cornell's response to all of this. I saw him talking to Brianna Joy Gray recently, and I thought, I liked what he had to say. Norm Finkelstein liked his comment on it, and that's the guy you should turn to first and foremost, right? Norm Finkelstein, who spent 40 years of his professional life studying this. And I don't know if you watch the videos of his interview with Craig Pasta Jardula, the guest host of Jimmy Dore.
I watched a bit.
I can tell you exactly what his position on it is, and I think it's quite reasonable. But I mean, his is a voice you must listen to. Like, he knows this situation better than anyone. But he approved of Cornell's statement, and I know that you sent me a tweet from RBN, like Nick didn't like Cornell's statement. He preferred the statement of the candidate running for I can never remember the name of that party, the Party of Socialism and Liberation, is it? Who basically, just expressed unqualified support for Palestine and Palestinian resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Which and then Nick was saying, Nick Cruz of RBN was criticizing Cornell West's take, saying this is some both sidesism, and Cornell addressed that in his interview with Brianna. Like, he's saying, this is what people are criticizing me before, but I don't care because I denounce violence against civilians no matter where it's coming from, no matter what the reason. And then he mentioned Nat Turner too. He said, I support Nat Turner's resistance and his slave revolt, but I'm not down with him killing kids and terrorizing people, which he admitted was one of his tactics. So it's possible to have a nuanced view, right? I mean, you could also say that that's kind of avoiding the issue, because if you're saying you support a slave revolt, then you have to know that's going to include violence. But does it have to be violence against civilians, kids, elderly, people not in uniform? Even, I'm just thinking of like movies and TV shows depicting the life of gangsters, like Breaking Bad, for example. It's always, if you involve civilians, they call them civilians, normies that aren't leading a life of crime. That's a line that, there's honor among thieves and criminals, right? Like, you don't do that.
Right.
You can kill the people that are also in the game, as it were, but you don't do that. I don't know if you've seen Breaking Bad, but the character Mike has a real problem with Gus when some civilians are involved, and Mike is ruthless. Like, he's done all kinds of horrible things, but he still has a code, right? Like, you don't involve the innocent.
That comes back to Scarface, right? There's the scene where he doesn't want to set off that bomb on that journalist.
Yes, right. Like exactly, because the wife and the kids are there. This is so fucking bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to kill kids? You a big man. So, I mean,
and it makes me think, the show that I'm into right now, since it's been reduced to a discussion of different series. No, we're watching Money Heist right now, my wife and I. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Okay, well, you should watch it. It was Spanish made, massive on Netflix. I think it's like second biggest grossing after Squid Game, and it has some parallels in terms of some of the aesthetics, but yeah, it's about a group of thieves who robbed the Spanish mint in Madrid and then have hostages there. But yeah, it's also like another massive priority for the professor who's behind the heist to avoid any casualties. And he actually wants to get the public on his side by making a point of not killing anyone and more focusing on just social inequality. But anyway, what do you think about? I mean, you brought up the Cornell situation. Is there
what do you think of his take on it? I mean, you didn't tell me your opinion.
Yeah, I know. Well, I wanted to say just that I think it's all about. I mean, I know this is a lot to ask, right? I just think it's like we want war to be somehow principled, but again, like I hate to take any position that Tim Pool might take, but he was saying, the argument that that there can be international law in war is kind of preposterous. I'm gonna table that because I don't really. That's maybe a separate discussion, and I don't want to completely disavow the idea of international law. But all I was gonna say is, I think what upsets people is beyond just killing civilians as like collateral damage. It's more like some of the gruesome scenes we see where this killing is done with a level of zeal and exaltation, which definitely I can't get behind. And when you see that, you start to see some of the Israeli reactions as being easier to stomach. I mean, there is a level of savagery, obviously, that that could come from Hamas, could come from the Israeli army, could come from the American army, but there are levels of brutality that humans descend to, which is subhuman, and I haven't seen too much from this conflict, but I've heard that some of the kind of footage has that kind of like, I'm gonna put this on social media and like show my boys, that's almost like a different category in itself, right? Than like trying to fight your way out of the fences and killing some people along the way, right? So it's all about the intention, I would say. Like, are you trying to kill civilians for the sake of killing civilians, or are you doing it because this is like your way of just
liberating
resisting
yourself?
Yeah, liberating yourself.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's disgusting. But again, how many social media posts have we seen of Israeli soldiers fucking with Palestinian kids, for throwing rocks or whatever?
For sure.
No one talks about that. I mean, that's not the same as murdering them, but I've not seen. Is there a video of someone murdering someone and then filming it and posting it somewhere?
I'm pretty sure there is some stuff, yeah, from like the music festival, for example. I think there were some scenes. I don't know. I haven't sought out that stuff, but I'm pretty sure if you want to find some grizzle from that initial attack, I think you can definitely find some barbarism.
Well, here's maybe a good time for me to share what Norm Finkelstein said. He's like, okay, his final statement on this, at least at the time of that interview, was, I neither condone nor condemn what was done. Okay? I can't. I'm not in a position to do that because I don't know what I would do under those same conditions. Let's say I was a 20-year-old kid who grew up, who was born into an open air prison or concentration camp or whatever you want to call it. I've never had a job. I've been harassed all my life. I've lived every day of my life with the threat of power being cut off, not having water or only having salt water to bathe in for 3 hours a day, dealing with food scarcity. That's my whole life. And I have the opportunity to break free. Well, I don't know what I would do. Maybe I would succumb to those baser instincts. So I cannot, even though I'm revolted and appalled and disgusted, he always takes it back to his parents, who were concentration camp survivors. What's he going to tell them? Hey, it's okay for you to break out of the concentration camp, but be nice to the prison camp guards. Don't unnecessarily harm anyone. Of course, you can't say that right? Like they're fighting for their lives. They're going to kill anyone and everyone to escape. Now, if there was a fucking rave going on next to Auschwitz and the concentration camp inmates who escaped in this hypothetical situation went in there and lit up party goers or whatever, maybe that's a different thing. But his point is they're resisting occupation, which they're legally entitled to do. That is the important question. That's the context all of this is happening in. And so it's not his position to judge them, just like he wouldn't have judged his parents, who were concentration camp survivors, if they had killed some people that they considered their oppressors or complicit with their oppressors, in order to obtain their freedom. What can he say? Like, you're going to say, oh, you shouldn't have done that. You should have just accepted your condition, or, you know, tried to be.
I think that's a really good point.
Tried to be nicer.
I think that's a really good point.
So what can we say? I mean, at the same time, maybe we can't condemn Israelis who are, you know, motivated by a desire for revenge too, but we can step back and say, look, whatever your feelings right now, like personally and emotionally, you have to consider the context, you have to consider the history, you have to consider international law, you have to consider the power imbalance, you have to consider the fact that you're the motherfuckers who go around saying you're the most moral army in the world and all of that, right? So you're the one holding yourself to a higher standard. So which is it? You're the most humane and moral, you know, army and people in the world? Or is your line that, okay, they're animals, so we have to become animals too, and we're going to flatten Gaza, we're going to turn it into a parking lot? I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no,
go ahead.
I got caught up with what you were saying. I just think that, and this comes back to, so I think that's a really good point. First of all, I think it's demanding empathy. I'm getting a bit distracted by this light behind my head, but it's demanding empathy. It's saying, you know, and we know this is what literature is all about. He's like stepping into other people's shoes. Atticus Finch, reading my To Kill a Mockingbird right now, step into another person's shoes. So when I initially said that we need to hear the Palestinian voices, this is what it all comes down to. It's like, it's easy to be pro-Israel when you don't hear anything from the Palestinians' perspective. And especially when this is like a matter of life or death, and we're about to potentially see a genocide. Yeah, for the media not to give voice to both sides is like absolute, you're complicit. You are complicit in allowing something to happen. And yeah, the least we can do is try to realize this is a human response to a certain situation. This is what humans do in this situation. And we're all each other. So this is me in this environment. You know what I mean? And like, I don't know. Are there any points? Have you had any interesting discussions with people? Maybe some like fault lines that maybe are interesting, or have you had any like internal conflict on this issue? Something like any of those kind of things might be interesting for us to discuss a little bit before we wrap up.
Well, like as I said earlier, I'm preparing this book for publication, and like I finished it in January of this year, even though most of the events described are from 2014. As I say, I was there during the last asymmetrical war. But there's a little author's note at the beginning that is dated October 2023, or it's a note to the reader, let's say, and I'm really struggling with the phrasing, and it's a very short little note. It's just saying, like, I woke up this morning to the news that the Holy Land, in quotation marks, is once again in flames. And then so, I discuss some of the things that we've been talking about here, right? Like the coverage of this event is completely biased. No one talks about the context. And, I'm somehow trying to tie that.
I lost you.
I'm somehow trying to tie that into the publication of this book, right? Which is based on, which was conceived during the previous war. So it's difficult trying to tie it all together, and it's also difficult phrasing things in a balanced way, but also, expressing my true feelings about it. I'm trying to, like, find the right words to express how I feel about the current situation and how that relates to the previous situation, which is and the current situation is really a continuance of that previous situation. It's all connected. There's a long history,
For sure.
And it's I don't want to be overly provocative and volatile, but I also want to clearly express, as I understand it, my feeling about the current situation and my disgust with the hypocrisy and the double standards. And, that's another aspect of this, right? Like, they're talking about some of those victims were Americans. Some of them were Americans. It's like, oh, okay. So remember Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist that was killed by the IDF? No one gave a shit about her. Her death was not weaponized for political purposes, at least not by the powerful, right? It was a total cover up, and the US went along with the cover up, even though many journalists were asking about it. All the US said in response was, well, the IDF is investigating themselves. They're doing their own internal investigation, and of course we're going to trust whatever they say. And they always say the same thing. Oh, it was a horrible accident, just like Rachel Corrie being run over by a bulldozer. Oh, it was an accident. Horrible accident. The USS Liberty, going back to the days of LBJ. You know about this? There was a U.S. naval reconnaissance ship out there during the 1967 war. They were fucking attacked by Israel, and it was covered up by LBJ and John McCain's father, and the survivors. There were some survivors. Every year they have a ceremony, commemorating their fallen comrades who were attacked by our ostensible ally. I said our, but let's say their ostensible ally, the U.S.'s ostensible ally, Israel. They fucking gunned down U.S. sailors on the USS Liberty. You can look it up. It's like, of course, they say, oh, it was an accident, And they violated international law there, too. They jammed their distress signals. That's a war crime. So there's a long history of that shit. They do whatever, and the U.S. just either turns a blind eye or they fucking make excuses for it and cover it up, help with the cover up. So knowing what I know, it's always disgusting. It's like, they were American citizens. Yeah, well, Shireen Abu Akleh was an American citizen too. Did you care when the IDF fucking shot her while covering, I think she was covering that peaceful protest,
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like today a Reuters journalist, or yesterday a Reuters journalist in Lebanon was killed by Israeli rocket fire, and when Reuters reported the death, they failed to mention how she died, and a lot of the responses on X were pretty disgusted by that. I wanted to ask you like a more personal question. I mentioned to you that I'm like concerned that I'm like oversaturating myself with this issue, and like to the detriment of my mood and my mental health. And I just wonder how you negotiate that personally. Like, do you ever feel like, okay, like I need to put my phone away or whatever? I mean, are you equally addicted to following this story? And the final question, so I've got a couple already there for you. The last thing I would add on to that is, at what point is this like we kind of, there's some part of us that like enjoys this as like the film, right? Like a film, and yeah, like a reality show, whether we want to admit it or not.
Well, let me start with the last question. I don't enjoy it. I mean, I think it's appalling and disgusting.
Not enjoy it like,
I know what you mean.
Like you're enjoying a hot dog.
I know. It's like is it like Greek tragedy?
It's like intrigue.
Well, yeah, or could be like catharsis, like Greek tragedy, seeing those horrific things. And I mean, Schopenhauer would say that we take comfort from the fact that, well, it's not us. It could be worse. We're not suffering that.
Yeah, but that's still a sense of enjoyment. I'm talking about just like a type of titillation. So I'm not talking about like a happy endorphin. I'm talking about just like stimulation.
I know what you're saying, and
I'm glad if you can unreservedly say that you don't get any of that from it.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not like investigating myself or questioning myself too closely there. Like, I'm following it because I think it's important. And I mean, I will say I have a friend that like sees this as a sign of the apocalypse, you know, and he would not be alone in that, right? Like a lot of the Christian Zionists that support Israel, they do so because they're hoping that their biblical prophecy will come true. It'll be the site of the war to end the world, and then Jesus will come and take us to heaven. And by the way, I actually went to Armageddon, which is in modern Israel called Megiddo. It's an actual place, and when there, I did some research and learned that Ronald Reagan was basically, you know, his foreign policy was based on the assumption that the end of the world would occur there, and so he had no problem, like, you know, with a war to end all wars going down there, because that would mean that the apocalypse was coming. So that's just an interesting side note that there are people.
No, that is
motivated by that.
But come back to my questions, please.
Well, about the mental health aspect, like, am I oversaturating myself?
Yeah, or like
I'm already so jaded and pessimistic, and I think this is just one of many ways that we're fucked. I mean, just because this happened doesn't mean that the Ukraine-Russia thing is over. It doesn't mean that the China-Taiwan situation is over. Like, the U.S. empire is, and its vassals are like causing trouble all over this globe. So it's just one flashpoint among many. It's the one that has our attention now, but it doesn't mean that Ukraine is over. It doesn't mean that, you know, whatever happened during the COVID disaster is over. They're still doing this dangerous research, bioweapons. Like, what's gonna be our doom? What's gonna destroy us? Take your pick, man. It could be any number of things. So it's all depressing.
I think that's a really good point. I'm just saying, like, in terms of like your day-to-day life, you know, there might, I might be following, again, I'm just speaking for myself here, but like I might be spending time on this rather than reading a book, you know? Whereas I think the reading the book, I mean, at what point does a person just kind of like detach themselves a little bit and say, reality's fucked, like this is history repeating itself, humanity does this, I'm going to create my own little world.
What I often do in that situation is think, you know, however bad I feel for myself, oh, I'm so miserable and depressed, how unfortunate. I try to put myself in the position of a Palestinian in the Gaza Strip. Like, and then I feel ashamed of myself. You know, it's like I'm complaining about my privileged life with all the benefits I have. Yes, there are many annoying things, there are injustices I suffer. There are a lot of fucking idiots like you know, interfering with my life in various ways, or people I have to deal with at work or wherever it may be, you know, some asshole at the 7-Eleven it could be, or whatever, right? And then I just feel embarrassed. I feel ashamed of myself. I'm complaining about that. Just look at what these other
Again,
people
a good
are dealing
point,
with.
But I'm just asking, I want to know, like, how much, like, is there a point, like, what is the point of us following the story? And you know what I'm saying? I mean, do you understand what I'm saying? Like, I agree with what you just said, but I'm saying, like, when you have the decision to follow a current humanitarian disaster or play the guitar, is there any kind of tension there sometimes?
Well, that I see what you mean.
With your time.
I see what you mean. I mean, someone very close to me just is completely uninterested in politics or current affairs or you know what's the state of the world. Like she just doesn't care. It just doesn't. She just focuses on her life and the people close to her, and I can't argue with that. Like maybe that's the smarter thing to do, but that's not.
My person is like that too, pretty much.
Well, so that
I don't knock it at all.
Can we say that's wrong? I mean, maybe we're the idiots.
Definitely not.
Maybe we're the idiots, like obsessing over it and trying to understand it. But that I know that's how I am. Like I want to understand. I think it's important to understand because it does affect my life too. Like what's going on in other parts of the empire. I almost said the Matrix. That has an effect here. That has an effect here, you know, like it is all related, and those people are us, as you say, on both sides, you know. You could also put yourself in the position of an Israeli citizen whose kid was murdered by these resistance fighters or terrorists or whatever you want to call them. How would you feel about that? Like that would also be much worse than whatever little issues I'm dealing with. Like it's just overwhelming, and you have to have a certain modesty, and it really, for me, puts things in perspective. But I want to know what's going on because it relates to my life. I feel this is our world. I should know as much as I can about it, you know. And what can I do? Is there anything I can do? Am I complicit in this? Like, what can I do? Not much, but I can at least try to process it and then have an opinion and express it. Or if I don't have a strong opinion, I can talk about it and like process it with other people like you and anyone. And then, you know,
I'm just sometimes, this quote comes to mind sometimes from Thoreau, and I bet you know this quote, and it says, "To a philosopher, all news, as it is called, is gossip, and they who edit and read it are old women over their tea."
He's not wrong. I mean,
I think we maybe have even talked about this quote before. But
is that in Walden or?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've certainly read it then, but I don't remember that. I just remember his description of the ants that are fighting each other, and it reminds him of, humans and their armies at war.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, he was also an activist, right? Like, he was in jail for civil disobedience and refusal to pay the war tax. So he also involved himself in current affairs, right?
Yeah, and I think it's a fucking genocide that might just happen in a second. So I don't think we're certainly not immoral for feeling upset by it and
how
seeing what's going on.
How ironic is it that, these people that might commit a potential genocide are themselves, at least, or they identify themselves with the people who experience that themselves. It's like
it's ironic and at the same time like completely logical, right?
Yeah, but that also explains the logic of the people who conducted the surprise attack. It's the cycle of violence. There's that line from the Auden poem. I can't quote it exactly, but those to whom evil is done do evil in return. So there it is.
Well, that's right. And so regardless of whether Gaza does become like a vacated parking lot, which then becomes an extension of Israel, like Israel's troubles are not over, certainly, and all these people who are affected, their family and their descendants will harbor an intense desire for revenge. So yeah, we need to continue championing sane voices of calm at the same time that we can empathize and understand with the violent instinct in people, but we have to try and go beyond that, I think.
Yeah.
Should we wrap it up there?
I think so.
Because who knows, in like a week's time, we may have a completely different landscape. Probably not a brighter one, but
well, that's the beauty of these emergency episodes. They're recorded at a particular time, and they may or may not remain relevant. If anyone even cares now, we don't know. We're sending out our message in a bottle, and
and what
we'll see what happens.
You still thinking about January potentially for a regular return to the show?
For the regular season 3,
well, even if it's bi-weekly?
Yeah, for the regular season 3, that sounds good, but I'm open to these emergency episodes at any time. Other things can come up.
But season 3 still looking at early 2024, yeah?
We can discuss it, but it makes sense to me. I think it's a good time to start. If we do bi-weekly, then it ends at a good time near the end of 2024, and then we're ready to start season 4. But yeah.
Okay.
All right, we'll leave it there.
All right, man. Yep. Peace to everyone who's suffering.